Clean!
The Legend of Korra positions its idea of the utopia to protect as the United States. It's a big reason why the politics in this series is really messy. It staunchly positions itself against everything that mainstream America, and by the extension of media control, a large part of the wider world, dislikes. Communism is just a vehicle for corrupt, false idols to create cults. Environmentalists are just power-hungry. Anarchists are just stupid, violent people who kill without any actionable work on the ground to change ideology or perspective. And nationalists, in response to having their land taken, are really just evil dictators. By virtue of wanting to have a big bad at the end of each story, Korra vilifies a large majority of these perspectives while under the guise of nuance. A major reason being that Republic City, the land that Aang and Zuko forged from Earth Kingdom territory, is really just a mini United States, presented as the harmony between benders and all the different elements. Ignoring all the immigration issues, I'm sure. But despite this, I really like Korra. I'm always enamored by stories that take place after revolution is won. How do we rebuild a world so broken by a 100-year war? What happens when the soldiers of rebellion are placed in positions of power? Oftentimes these stories demonstrate that just because these people have the power to win a war, doesn't mean they can form a functional society, let alone lead it. But I actually think Korra's political problems date back to Aang's struggle with Ozai, the question of whether or not he should take his life. A key part of the conflict is how Aang grapples with the non-violent teachings of his culture. How can he reconcile with a world that has become so vitriolic and violent by virtue of the war, that he can't find a way to peacefully end it? The answer is he doesn't. He takes Ozai's bending away and locks him in a prison for the rest of his life. Later on in his life, he'd go on to make these elaborate and cruel prison holds for the Red Lotus. If you see how he has them locked up, it's no wonder that they treat Korra the way that they do. Look at what Aang has them confined to. This kind of implies that Aang found a lot of solace in the idea of prison as a non-violent solution, and this naturally does the ideological work of the viewer to say that prison in and of itself is non-violent. Because Aang is positioned as this non-violent nomad of the group, his decisions are often conflated in the eyes of the audience as non-violent, when the reality is, prison very much is violent. We even see some of this treatment of Iroh in prison for Book 3. Prison abolitionists are dismissed as utopians and idealists, whose ideas are at best unrealistic and impractical, and at worst mystifying and foolish. This is a measure of how difficult it is to envision social order that does not rely on the threat of sequestering people in dreadful places designed to separate them from their communities and families. The prison is considered so natural that it's extremely hard to imagine a life without it. The obvious response here is, Ozai is an imperialist Nazi, he deserves this. But there's a few issues with this perspective, one being the existence of Zuko and Iroh. Both these characters for a time exhibit the exact same ideas and rhetoric. Zuko's main motivation isn't just to be accepted by his father, but to rule by the throne. He threatens the livelihood of several people, and just because we aren't made to see it, it's heavily implied he killed and treated people poorly in his search for Aang over those 3 years. Iroh tries to invade and burn down Ba Sing Se. The reason we're made to be more sympathetic to these characters is because the story is interested in humanizing them. You never get to see Iroh be the Dragon of the West, so you don't have to process that he was a colonialist. It's very similar with Zuko. You don't really get to see Zuko terrorize cities and villages. You see him defend the lives of Fire Nation soldiers, and then 3 years removed from his search, sympathize with his desperation, with his desire to be accepted by his father. The point I'm really trying to make here isn't that Zuko and Iroh don't deserve to be redeemed, but that the story isn't interested in humanizing Ozai, so he doesn't get that treatment. When a lot of the same arguments made for Iroh and Zuko could be made for Ozai. He was born into this idea that the Fire Nation was inherently superior. He comes from generations of this rhetoric. He didn't get the opportunity to be anything different. The only reason Zuko isn't exactly like his father is because he was banished and forced to face the realities of the world. I make this point not to frame myself as this Ozai sympathizer, but to make it clear that Avatar isn't afraid to humanize characters that for all intensive purposes could face very similar consequences to Ozai based on their actions. To quote Angela Davis, an attempt to create a new conceptual terrain for imagining alternatives to imprisonment involves the ideological work of questioning why criminals have been constituted as a class, and indeed, a class of human beings undeserving of civil and human rights accorded to others. Radical criminologists have long pointed out that the category of lawbreakers is far greater than the category of individuals who are deemed criminals, since many have pointed out, almost all of us have broken the law at one time or another. If the broad stroke to which we justify this imprisonment is the actions taken and the beliefs held, then the entire Fire Nation would need to be incarcerated. But we see throughout the show that this isn't inherently true. Aang first-hand experiences revisionist history and propaganda taught to the Fire Nation students. One of my favorite parts of the Book of Fire is how much it does to humanize the once vilified Fire Nation. These are just people being misdirected and mistaught. And this idea that there are a select few people exempt from this, to me, is inconsistent. Either we are products of our education or our environment, or we are not. If we can all agree that the entire Fire Nation isn't so far gone from the 100-Year War that they shouldn't all be incarcerated by virtue of being fed this propaganda, then why shouldn't we assume that Ozai is the exact same? Why shouldn't he, someone born into this world and sold this idea of supremacy as a reality, be afforded that same perspective? Now obviously this isn't what the show does. It makes a very clear point to make Ozai as evil as humanly possible because he needs to be. He is the big bad, and Aang plays this time-traveling faux messiah figure coming to end the war. I bring this up because I want people to question the framing and how differently characters like Zuko and Iroh are presented compared to Ozai, and how the show makes a point to skim over the atrocities committed by these characters because we're supposed to be endeared by them. It's selective, and this selective salvation is how the show justifies Aang's decision to lock him up and throw away the key. Selective salvation that has an impact on how viewers will ultimately see the situation. It's very easy, and you can tell who thinks this way because they'll comment something along the lines of, well, in the show this happened, so of course they have to do this. But that's just how it's written. That's just how it's framed. You need to look beyond what is written in media you're consuming and think about what it's saying, because this isolated thinking is how we ignore the impact media has on people. The most ignorant thing anyone can tell you is that the media has no effect on the way we see the world, on what we believe is normal. Young people watch this show and relate to these characters. It's very easy to do so. My mother died when I was 9. Of course I relate to Katara. I grew up religious and felt socially isolated as a result. Of course I relate to Aang. I grew up with an abusive parent. Of course I relate to Zuko. I grew up with a set of expectations from my parents that was contrary to who I actually was. Of course I relate to Toph. But I'm also not so narcissistic that I think I'm the only one that thinks this or felt this way, that latched onto this media as a result. Case in point, the only reason this channel exists is Avatar. The first reason I grew interested in telling stories is because I grew up watching Avatar. It's the reason I love storytelling. So we need to be very careful of these things. What message are we sending to young people? What ideas are they internalizing and taking into the wider world? An Avatar positioning prison as a pacifistic solution to problems is a byproduct of a society that has normalized the idea of prison. A society that lacks the imagination to consider the prospect that the idea of prison is inherently violent, vengeful, and a retribution-driven solution to our problems. The reason you will always be framed as a naive idealist in the eyes of many for daring to dream of a world without prison, a world without war, a world without capitalism, isn't because you're naive, but because these things have become so normalized and ingrained into our society that most people lack the imagination to even think of a world outside that framework. And we have been indoctrinated with so much rhetoric regarding human nature and the necessity to capture and persecute the byproduct of our society that we don't even question it. There are people that, in order to justify their backwards ideas, compare our intelligence to animals. Like I'm supposed to look at a fox or a tiger or a monkey and compare my capacity to change to that. Like, respectfully, you're not a dog, you're not a tiger, and you're definitely not a monkey. And you have to think so little of society but yourself to truly believe that that's all we're capable of replicating. I love Avatar. I love so much of it. But despite being a show with such an emphasis on hope and change, it still adopts the world's deeply cynical view that any form of radical change from the status quo is naive idealism or just virtue signaling extremism masquerading as societal change. Again, I'm not trying to make people think like me. I'm just trying to make people think, just in general. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. I'm the storyteller, and I'll see you around.
It's a problem, you better follow me. I give you this, you get the lottery. I know all the stars, astrology. Last deposit, fucked all the economy. Getting it, spent 2010 pitching, kush piffing it. Heavyweight straight infinite, you different. Last night, picturing 7 times that black chick trying white me. Better line, I'm the future. Real beef, I shoot you. Walk, no talk, no subbing, no woofers, it's on. Tell by my tone. Real call, better answer.